And I think I'd like to start by reading a poem by English poet John Milton. I think it's a beautiful little poem. A broad and ample road, whose dust is gold, and pavement stars as starts to thee appear, soon in the galaxy, that Milky Way, which nightly as a circling zone thou seest powdered with stars. I think that's just beautiful imagery for what we see when we look up at night. Well, since as far back as oral history and written history is recorded, mankind has been fascinated with the heavens. Establishing an understanding of the heavenly bodies and observing their processions has been an important pursuit for many ancient peoples all over the globe. However, without a strict scientific language to define what they saw, much of what they recorded and much of what they believed was written as metaphor and myth and legend. As mankind marched ahead with a scientific method, we began to develop a concise language to identify the heavens and explain what's happening up there. In contemporary astrophysics, the ancient wisdom is now completely considered useless. This has left us with two seemingly opposite understandings of our place in the cosmos. On the one hand, science seeks to divide each concept so that they may be understood and labelled independently of the other disciplines. The beliefs developed by the dogma of science are presented to us via documentary film without clarification as to which are facts and which are hypotheses quite often. On the other hand, our ancient understandings reach us via poorly translated snippets from languages we don't fully understand, and which are often anecdotal, metaphorical, and vague, with cited sources being deities and other prophets. So truly then, how can we know about our place in the cosmos? Can the ancient wisdom and the modern view be reconciled? Is there a point where they meet? Can they be matched up? You can see on this slide here, I've got sort of a basic representation on the left, how science views our solar system, heliocentric, with the sun in the centre, but the ancients were just looking up at the sky from where they were, and so they had a geocentric view on the solar system. So let us start with the ancient perspective, because it came first, right? Greek mythology used the stars to tell of great beasts and the heroes who had fought them. The characters were used to describe archetypes within the peoples, and the gods had domains, and the heroes had specific qualities. The men and women who made it to this land in canoes used the stars as navigation, and as we know, a lot of cultures use the stars as navigation. Songs, stories, and oral tradition were employed to pass on information about stars and what their locations mean. According to certain anthropologists, the Dogon tribe, which are pictured here, of West Africa displayed advanced knowledge of a particular star in the Sirius constellation. Ancient traditions and complex ceremonies aligned with the movement of the star, and through oral tradition, its significance is explained to the tribe. What is fascinating, though, is that the star itself is completely invisible to the naked eye. We can't see it in the sky. It wasn't until the early 70s that astrophysicists discovered the star. It's quite interesting, isn't it? How did they know? So the information as presented by these ancient societies can be loosely grouped into four categories. Astrology, and many societies are strongly flavoured by the idea that the position of each celestial body has a direct and noticeable effect on everything here on Earth, including us. Navigation, as we talked about, many seafaring nations relied on the stars to navigate. Narration, often the stars are used as a backdrop to tell the story of creation or the birth of a particular society. Moral guidance is also dispensed within this category, and struggles between the forces of good and evil and the complex relationship between man and the gods. Prophecy, that's an area that we haven't touched on yet. The societies which displayed quite advanced knowledge of the stars also seem to have quite a definite idea of our future, which is quite an interesting point, I think. So the first three categories, they're quite interesting, but they sort of have historical meaning, whereas that last category may still be pertinent to us today. So I think that's the one we might investigate. So with that in mind, let's find out what they said about our modern era. I think a good place to start is in the Bible. Specifically, let's look at the recordings made by one of Jesus' first apostles, Peter. He says here in chapter 3, verse 6 and 7, "Long ago the earth was covered with water, and it was destroyed. But the heaven we see now, and the earth we live on now, have been kept by His word. They will be kept until they are to be destroyed by fire." I've gone through and I've highlighted fire there because you'll start to notice a pattern as we go along. "The day of the Lord will come as a robber comes." I think what he's talking about there is the robber never sends you a text first to let you know he's coming. "The heavens will pass away with a loud noise. The sun and moon and stars will burn up. The earth and all that is in it will be burned up." The Native American Hopi tribe, they have prophets who disappear into very special caves and probably take some very interesting natural plants, and they have a very clear image on what they see as our future, and they also mimic or mirror what Peter was saying a little bit. So they say that the first world was destroyed by fire, and they're a little bit unclear. Was it a comet, an asteroid strike, or a number of volcanic eruptions? The second world was destroyed by ice, and this, of course, we see when we dig into the earth. And the third world, and this is where we start to line up with what Peter was saying, it was destroyed by a tremendous deluge. So now we're in the fourth world, according to the Hopi, and they forecast that fire, again, will be the purifying agent that ultimately brings us into the next world. It's starting to sound pretty familiar? Let's go on. The Mahabharata. And I love this first one because it's almost like just a casual, the energy of the Supreme Lord looked like the Samvartaka fire, which destroys all creatures at the end of the Yuga. Like, you already know that, but I'm just trying to explain what the energy of the Supreme Lord looked like. But then they go on other sections. "The fire called Samvartaka, impelled by the winds, appeareth on the earth, that hath already dried to cinders by the 7 suns." That's another little interesting piece. We have another Native American tribe up the top there. What do they say? "Now we think that when the end comes, the earth will be destroyed by fire, and not one upon it will escape, for all the earth will be enveloped in flames. And all those who refuse to believe in that word will be in it." I think that's quite interesting. They're talking about a complete fire, which sort of, if you think about how that would logistically work, it's got to be some sort of solar event. You can't have a fire start in a city and take over the world. It would have to come from the sky. The Buddhists talk about the Monaka Mountains flare and blaze and become one mass of flame. The Norse tradition talks about Surta. He brandishes a flaming sword, and at the end of the world he will go forth and harry and overcome all the gods and burn all the world with fire. The Gnostics and the Islamic, we don't need to read it, we get the point now, right? Like, they all say fire, a global fire. So before we go on that train of thought, I think it's important to investigate the limitations of language. And it's something I don't really hear discussed a lot when we look at the ancient texts. So why do we need to investigate the limitations of language? Well, because the language we use today has been evolving for thousands of years. According to some estimates, we are adding over 700 words a year to the English language. Now, some of these words are pretty useless inside the ancient context. For instance, the word selfie, But they wouldn't have needed that to describe what they were seeing. There are some words that they might have needed to describe what they're seeing. Words like machine, propeller, or rocket engine. Yeah. Is there anywhere in the Bible that these words may have been more apt than what we find? let's have a look at the testimony provided by Ezekiel. Yep, you're onto it. Right at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, he describes what happened to him one day when he was among a group of captives down by the river of Chebar. He writes, "The heavens were open, and I began to see visions of God." So good so far. Already sounds like it's going to be quite interesting, actually, if you're looking up and there's God. Ezekiel continues by painting a very descriptive picture of what and how these so-called visions of God appeared. The image on the left of the screen is created by taking what Ezekiel wrote in a very literal sense, taking the actual words that were translated into English and then applying those to imagery. Doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So he says, "As I was looking, I saw a tempestuous wind coming from the north, and there was a huge cloud and flashing fire surrounded by a bright light." Well, already that image on the right starts to make a little bit of sense. "And from the midst of the fire was something that looked like electrum." If you're not familiar with electrum, those are a couple of electrum wedding bands down there. It's an alloy of gold and silver. Well, let's keep going. Within it were what looked like, very important piece of the sentence, 4 living creatures, and the appearance of each was like that of a human. And their feet were straight, and the sole of their feet was like the sole of a calf's foot. And they sparkled like the colour of burnished brass. When I heard the sound of their wings, it was like a sound of rushing waters. Clearly, Ezekiel's language was limited. Living before the advent of aerodynamics, jet propulsion, the internal combustion engine, or advanced metallurgy meant that if Ezekiel had seen those things, he would not be able to describe them in terms that we would recognize. The Spaceships of Ezekiel is a book written in the early 70s by Joseph Blumrich, who at the time was chief of NASA's Systems Layout Branch. Initially, Joseph set out to disprove the hypothesis that Ezekiel was describing a UFO. However, a thorough examination convinced him that Ezekiel was describing an aerial vehicle. So let's move into the modern era. And that's a good place to go because we have the full descriptive might of the English language now. Our solar system is now, and has been since it began, moving through the galaxy. As it orbits the cluster of black holes, we think, at its centre. As you can see in this infographic, it has passed through areas of different energies in the past, and we believe that moving through these areas may have changed our planet. So we can see here, the sun and planets may have originated closer to the galaxy's centre and surfed outwards along its spiral arm. Just like to point out that's hypothesis, not fact. Passing through bright star-forming regions might have exposed Earth to hazardous radiation from supernovae, perhaps causing mass extinctions. Passing through dark interstellar dust clouds could have altered Earth's climate, perhaps leading to episodes of global glaciation. And what we have over here is quite interesting. As we're moving around the galactic plane, we're also wobbling up and down through it. 200 light years each side, that's quite a lot of wobble. And it's thought that as our galaxy is moving through the universe, we're creating a bow shock. The universe isn't empty space, it's full of highly charged particles. And as we're moving, we're creating this bow shock as the two energies collide. And they believe that when we're on the upside of our galactic plane, we're exposed to a lot more of that universal energy. Let's move inwards a little bit from the galaxy into our solar system. Here on this image, we can see the solar system there in the center, and these rings here are the outer planets, so it's quite small in the middle. It's just a representation though. And what our sun's doing, as Murray touched on, our sun's expelling massive amounts of gas and radiation, and these are called the solar winds. They're supersonic, they travel through our solar system very quickly, and they're highly charged, a lot of conductivity to them. And as that expansion of energy outwards from our sun reaches the pushing in energy from the interstellar medium, which is the gas and charged particles from the outside of our solar system, it creates this shape. There's a balance of those two forces, and at that balance we find the heliopause. Something interesting to be noted about that interstellar medium and the solar winds coming out of the sun is neither force is constant. It's not always the same. And so what you actually expect to see, it's very hard to observe because we've only got those two little probes out there and they were sent out in the 70s. What we expect to see is that form over time should grow and shrink and deform and change shape. It's a very dynamic system because it's the balancing of two forces. The sun's properties, such as its luminosity, are related to its magnetic field, although the connections are not very well understood. And changes in the heliospheric magnetic field have been linked with changes in total cloud cover here on Earth, which may influence global climate. Like the heliosphere around our solar system, as we saw in the last slide, we have a magnetosphere around Earth. The powerful force of the solar wind is multifaceted. It has heat and kinetic energy, but it also has electromagnetic energy. And so it interacts with our planet in many different ways. This force electrically charges our atmosphere. The solar wind applies a great deal of pressure crashing into our magnetosphere. And as that pressure is applied, and as Murray was saying before, the solar wind moves around our magnetosphere, it gets caught. The highly charged plasma gets caught in our magnetotail here. It's kind of like this little pocket. As the speed and pressure of the solar wind is adjusted, the shape of the fields around our planet are deformed. When the magnetic field lines collapse, that pool of energetic particles at the tip of the magnetotail are propelled back towards Earth with a lot of energy. When this kind of event happens, we see obvious results here on Earth with a massive uptick of the aurora activity at the poles. And if you really squint at that animation, you can even see just a little, in the last few frames, you see a little sparkle up there around the poles. Little is understood about the Earth's magnetic field or how it's even produced. We theorize there's a lot of ferrous material in the core of the Earth. However, many scientists blatantly tell us that these effects have no effect on us whatsoever. I believe this to be an example of the limiting effects of the dogma within science. Those who have tried to submit their ideas with supporting evidence quite often are ostracized. I won't go into detail now, but some have found that with the magnetic line collapses like this, it correlates with the climate, correlates with earthquakes, and even geopolitical events such as war. It doesn't matter at which scale we observe something in our universe, we find that there is an electromagnetic connection. Above the scale of galaxies, we have superclusters, thousands of galaxies grouped together. And when we get a lot of these superclusters gathered together, they make filaments. And on the right, we have a diagram of our own atmosphere and how it too is really just an electromagnetic circuit. So we're starting to see another pattern emerge. We saw with the ancients there was quite a pattern, and now when we look at the stars and we look at space, we talked about the filaments, the plasmic filaments, connecting the stars in the sky. Everything is connected in an evident way that we can see with our modern scientific equipment. So to summarize what we've been through so far, we touched on the differences, the different points of view that we have on the heavens. We have the ancient and the modern perspective. We investigated how some of the ancient peoples were fascinated with the stars and how they used them to tell stories. We also had a look at the fire, all that doom and gloom. Sorry to bring the room down like that. And we've also now had a look at some of the connectivity that we see in our solar system and beyond. So now I think it's time to start blending some of this information together. You may not have realized it just yet, but everything we've been discussing is pointing towards the exact mechanism of what some people call Armageddon. I found these books here quite helpful by giving new insight into many of the traditional understandings of gods, angels, and our place in the universe. Not because it holds any new information on these topics, but because it has been received and transcribed in recent history. And so the concepts contained are written using the full descriptive might of modern English. Just wonderful. In these books, Ra, as you can see over there on the left, he identifies itself as an entire society united in service to the universe. An entire society which solely endeavours to promote love and harmony. And they're united because each member of that society understands that they are all part of the one thought. Ra believes that the one thought is all that there is. It is God, it is the universe, it is us. All matter is energy, and all energy is consciousness, and all consciousness is part of the one single thought. Ra explains that there is a hierarchy of that consciousness, of which we have our part to play. The energy being emitted from the galactic centre affects what type of energy each star within the galaxy will emanate. And so the energy from each star will affect the planets orbiting that star, and the planets will affect the creatures living on that planet. And we too, our energy, our thoughts affect our cells. They affect those that live within us. In these books, Ra talks about the transition our society. Ra quantifies the single thought as operating at different densities. He talks about densities of consciousness. So this is from the 13th session in Book 1. And it's sort of when the questioner finally sort of figured out maybe we should start asking some big questions. And he asked about, all the different prophecies and all the different ideas that are talked about the ending of our age. And Ra answered that the fourth density is, as we have said, as regularized in its approach as the striking of a clock upon the hour. The space-time of your solar system has enabled this planetary sphere to spiral into space-time of a different vibrational configuration. This causes the planetary sphere to be able to be molded by these new distortions. However, the thought forms of your people during this transition period are such that the mind-body complexes, mind-body-spirit complexes, which is us, he sees us as those three individual concepts working together, of both individual and societies are scattered throughout the spectrum, instead of becoming able to grasp the needle, shall we say, and point the compass in one direction. Thus, the entry into the vibration of love, sometimes called by your people the vibration of understanding, is not effective within the present societal complex. In this short passage, Ra offers an explanation for the mechanism of Armageddon and also gives us a glimpse into the truth when he talks about grasping the needle. We are actually in control of how Armageddon will proceed. You see, the hierarchy of consciousness is not only affected in one direction, but it is us as a society who get to choose how we make this transition. We can affect up that hierarchy. Many are beginning to consider that we may be part of a great mind, and that to understand our place in this great mind is to take our place. Whatever answers are in the heavens, or how we will ever find them, are some things I do not know. I've got to give this little caveat. Everything included in this talk is information ascertained by other people. I can't really trust any of them. I've never met any of them. However, I feel that with an understanding of the heavens, we may be better able to understand ourselves. My goal with this short talk is not to convince you of anything new or change your beliefs. All I hope is that we can all start to see ourselves as members of the universal consciousness and not as rate-paying citizens under the jurisdiction of whatever council. Now, I kind of ripped through a lot of that at breakneck speed, and I'm sure there are some questions.
It's very interesting, the different civilizations talk about fire and the end of the earth. I heard in about 1976, the biggest solar flare ever detected headed towards this planet, and it was several times bigger than the planet. There is, what's happened is that normally all power stations around the world will shut down automatically. They're ready for this. governments will go underground. And they were starting to do this. It's about, is it 3 days it takes for the solar flare to come from the sun to us? That there's a little warning time.
Yeah.
So the receivers picked up this information about this enormous solar flare, which no doubt was going to completely destroy the planet. So they made the preparations to shut down everything just before it came. And just before it hit the Earth, it completely disappeared. And I haven't found anywhere of any explanation of it disappearing, or it was deflected. And to me, there is something going on at a maybe high level. There's somebody looking after us out there. And I have faith in that. So although there might be this fire, I think there's also other aspects to us as well.
Yeah, I've heard similar things to that. The Ra entity talks about various steps that they have taken to give us more time. Because they notice, they go on in this book, it was written in the 80s, that at that period in time, there wasn't many people who were going to be able to make it through. And so they've, according to what they say, they've made countermeasures to give us that time and to help us come together and figure out how we're going to deal with this. One of the measures that I've heard other humans talking about, and people, that they've seen these large blue spheres through various explorations of the solar system, and that these large blue spheres have been moving in certain configurations in our solar system to help buffer these cosmic energies as they come in. Because what I didn't mention is that we're already in that higher vibration. The solar system's already made that transition. It's us who isn't ready, and so, like I say, various steps have been made to make sure we can prepare ourselves.
When you shared that little bit where you said to understand our place is to take our place in the universe. So when you look at our responsibility, what we can do, and if there's this great fire that's going to happen eventually, I mean, who's to know it's not in a few months. The Earth has heated up in an enormous way, that our responsibility would be to raise our vibration. You think of vibration when you think of electromagnetic field. So our full responsibility is to raise our vibration and to know who we are, and that's what we can do as individuals right now. To me, all roads lead to that one space. Yeah.
And as Anthea also mentioned, that helps fellow man. Yeah.